Okay, we've got Banning Garrett, Jack Pritchard, and Dave Gordon up here for 45 minutes. So please.
Karen from Greenwich, Connecticut. Why does the United States continue to sell arms to Taiwan? It seems like there's more negative consequences than positive. Comment.
Who wants to start?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Good luck.
No, it's not something to laugh at. I mean, the U.S. has long been committed to the security of Taiwan. It also is committed to China as a single entity. It's absolutely the Chinese, back when Chen Shui-bian was the head of state in Taiwan, the Chinese mainland really thought that the U.S. was going to enable Chen to take Taiwan out of the ambit of China. We did not do so. The Chinese actually give us a lot of credit, more than we're due, for facilitating his exit from power. But the U.S. position has been to basically support a balance of military force in order to continue to dissuade the Chinese from militarily attacking Taiwan. Taiwan is a democratic country. In fact, the political support for Taiwan in the United States is stronger today than it used to be before it became a democracy. It's not going to go away. We support reintegration, but that process has to be through a negotiated process between the two countries, between China and the entity of Taiwan, not a country.
As a follow-up, could you ever foresee a situation when we would be drawn into some sort of military conflict?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Chinese military expenditures, they're heavily involved in technologies that will make it more difficult for the United States to speedily defend Taiwan. So the Chinese military expenditures aren't about, getting into the shipping lanes or getting into the Near East. I think they have a long-term aspiration, but it's all about making it harder for the U.S. to defend Taiwan. I don't think they're doing that in order to attack Taiwan. I think they're doing it to try to encourage a negotiation there from a position of strength.
Great, thanks. In the balcony here.
Thank you. My name is Mel Mckay. I'm from John Baptist School in Bangor. I'm not sure to whom I should address this question, but I sense that one of the things that really hasn't been talked much about at the conference is Tibet. And yet if you bump into Americans, certainly over the last few years, and China comes up, almost one of the first topics of conversation is going to be something about Tibet, whether we've seen a film or whether we've met somebody. And I would just like to invite any of the panelists to give us a little perspective, perhaps from the Chinese, and then from a policy standpoint from that of the United States.
Who wants to take this one on? Volunteers?
So,
Right, Dave.
I mean, I think the Chinese view Tibet correctly as an integral part of China. In their view, the Dalai Lama is committed to secession of Tibet and to fomenting trouble around the Tibet issue among Tibetans. Now, my own view is that that's a mistaken perception on the part of China, but I think that every American administration has to walk this fine line between respecting the position of the Dalai Lama as a spiritual leader, but also respecting Chinese sovereignty issues here. And I think that it's it's something that is never going to make everybody happy.
Banning, Jeff?
I'd just add, I think that China really has a problem with minorities and how to deal with them and how to deal with integration. If you look at the Xinjiang and the Uyghur population, it seems like a lot of the problem is they moved a huge number of Han Chinese into both Tibet and Xinjiang. And these people go in there and they set up the businesses, they have all the good jobs. When it comes to hiring, well, would you hire a Uyghur or a Tibetan who's maybe not as educated as a Han and doesn't speak Mandarin as well? And so all the problems that our country has faced with its minorities. What's that?
Can't hear you, sorry.
It's not working? Technology failure? More decline of America. We can't even get the bloody
okay.
microphones to work. It's good. Is that good?
Actually, Banning, it's made in China. That's ridiculous.
Well, but isn't everything? But anyway, I just think they've got a tough problem. How do you deal? Because I think in some cases, and I don't know the Xinjiang issue well, so I'm really talking beyond my real knowledge here, but I have a feeling that the central government's own policies about integrating and affirmative action, let's bring up the level of the Uyghurs, and it doesn't really resonate necessarily with the local Han population that has its own kind of racist attitudes toward these people, and creates a lot of difficulties. And they may not be, it's again, well, they're not as educated as the others, so I'll take them. So the Uyghurs feel that they're discriminated against. In fact, they are, and the same thing with the Tibetans, I suspect. And it's a real problem, and I think we need to be saying to China, this is your problem.
Okay.
You figure it out. It's not that we're fomenting the problem. We're not supporting Taiwan. We're not supporting Taiwan independence. We're not supporting Tibetan independence. We're not supporting Uyghur separatism. You've got a problem, and you've got to figure out how to deal with it, and we understand it's not an easy one.
I think the Chinese have a real challenge with the Western development strategy, because I think this is one of the carryovers of Marxism. I think their view is if they bring development out to the West, then the political problem is going to go away. In fact, it's going to get much worse, because development brings all these Han Chinese, and they come into conflict. And so the strategy, I think, is designed for stability, but I think it's so ill-conceived, to my mind, that it's almost certainly to have the opposite effect.
I think I've got the word that Ellsworth is online. Is that okay? Ellsworth? No? Yes? Ellsworth, here you are. All right. You all can read it down here. What is the reason, justification, need for maintaining an underwater fleet and air patrol off the Chinese coast, and what will be the likely reaction when a similar Chinese squadron shows up off the Golden Gate Bridge, or San Diego, as somebody said yesterday? Yeah. Who wants to handle that?
Yeah, so it's going to be a little while before they show up off the Golden Gate Bridge, and hopefully by then this will be seen as a great technological achievement by China.
By us?
But by us?
Or when we have a better relationship. But right now, it is, again, part and parcel of the fact that we have been the security guarantor in the Western Pacific since the end of World War II. And we continue to play that role, and in particular, ensuring stability between the mainland and Taiwan. Whether and how long this is going to go on is a good question, but that's what they're doing there.
I would sort of back up on it historically and say, in 1995, when Lee Teng-hui, the president of Taiwan, came to the United States and preached independence of Taiwan, I think this was basically a freak out for the Chinese who had really not focused on it, and the PLA, which was really not prepared. And of course, it led in '96 to the missile crisis when the PRC fired missiles off of, as Bill Perry liked to put it, was like as an old artilleryman on either side of the island and then down the middle. Chaz, I know, was in Beijing, I think, in December, perhaps, of '95, but just before this happened. So this was a wake-up call to the PLA, I think. But what really ensued from there was the concern in Beijing that Taiwan would, in fact, become permanently separate. I think independence is a word that isn't. I mean, they are an independent entity in reality, But the permanent separation is what really worried them. And for the PLA, all of a sudden, hey, we might be called on to prevent that, to intervene, to stop it. And by the way, the United States might show up. And how much military capability is enough to defeat the United States? Well, probably the answer is you'll never have enough, or at least it's a very big task. And so I think that was what led to the ensuing buildup of modernization of the PLA, particularly focused on the Taiwan contingency. And as you said, how do you deal with aircraft carriers? Well, you find asymmetric ways to deal with it, whether it's information warfare or anti-aircraft, ballistic missiles, whatever. You work on that problem, and they've been working on it really hard. Now, on the other side of the story is, I think in 2003, I would sort of, if you want to put a date on it, in December 2003, George Bush, President Bush at the time, I think answered a question that Taiwan had posed to the United States since '95. Will you support independence of Taiwan? I think they posed it to the Congress, to the United States, I would say, and of course the President. And at that point, Bush, who had come in as being seen as sort of favorable to Taiwan independence, basically answered it and said, no, we're not going to support permanent separation of Taiwan. We're not going to go to war with China so they can change the name of the country and the flag. That isn't going to happen. We support Taiwan's autonomy, its democracy, and I think we've had a pretty consistent policy now of we oppose unilateral change in the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, use of force by one side, independence by the other. And the way it's evolved in Taiwan, I think it's pretty clear that people in Taiwan recognize that, with the exception of a small minority, that independence is out of the question. And I think that for the PRC, I keep trying to say to them, you won that battle. Taiwan independence is not the problem. The problem is you got to win the hearts and minds of the people in Taiwan. And the sales of arms to Taiwan or no longer can be seen and perceived, I think, correctly as any encouragement of Taiwan to become independent, which I think they feared, perhaps, I don't think really rightly, but they feared it more 10, 15 years ago. Now it doesn't mean that. In fact, you can make the argument that giving Taiwan sufficient capability to sort of defend itself makes it more confident to enter into political negotiations and discussions with the mainland and move forward. And it prevents backlash in Taiwan of Greens and all who might once again raise the question of independence. So I'd say that the PLA right now, the problem is on your side. Start pulling back those missiles, start trying to diminish the threat you pose to Taiwan militarily, which it's not going to happen. We're not going to have a war. And try to do more to win the hearts and minds. Now, there's been a tremendous progress forward on the economic integration front, a lot of progress. So the problem is really not arms sales, but I want to add one more point to that. I think last year, a year ago, and Dave was making the point about the Chinese really strong reaction to American policies, and particularly to the announcement of arms sales. And here's a perfect example how out of sync we can get. When Obama went to Beijing in November of '09, he said privately to Hu Jintao, look, I'm going to have to continue arms sales, and they'll be announced sometime soon, and I'm going to have to see the Dalai Lama. And when he went forward with that in January of 2010, the Chinese reacted extremely sharply. And for the United States, it was a shock, I think, because we hadn't done anything different. I mean, the arms sales were no big surprise. We didn't sell F-16s and submarines they were worried about. This was the second $6 billion tranche of $18 billion that we agreed to sell them in 2001, 9 years later. So we're saying, what's the story here? And same with the Dalai Lama. He didn't upgrade the way we treated the Dalai Lama. But I think, and this goes back to what you're saying and all the problems of sort of misperception. I talked to a friend of mine in China right after that. I said, what's this business about this incredible overreaction to our arms sales? You know, bigger threats, bigger reaction. And I said, what's the end game here? What do you expect? You think we're going to suddenly say, oh, sorry, we didn't mean it, not sell arms? Nothing, you know that nothing is going to change. We didn't. And he said, there is no end game. He said, it's the emotion. For 30 years, we've swallowed the bitter pill of your arms sales to Taiwan, and we've had enough. It's this whole thing, we're stronger, you're the ones that screwed up. We're tired of putting up with being pushed around and our interests being violated. And I think that is part of the mentality that we have to try to deal with, that you've talked about, and Chaz and Xiang has. So I think we need to understand there's a context behind there, and I don't think there's a reality to any threat of a war over Taiwan at all. We're not that stupid. They're not that stupid to get in a conflict over Taiwan, but it has such deep meaning to the Chinese, and then the sense that they got to stop putting up with our selling arms to Taiwan, but it isn't going to change the actual reality. So a long answer.
All right, we're going to go up to the balcony down here and over there.
My name is Kate Taylor from North Haven, and I recall that in the 1400s, the amazing admiral from China, Chang'e, sailed the world, not militarily, but to show the wealth and power of China. And my question is, how is China doing this metaphorically today, these kinds of activities, and why? But of course, without the 440-foot ship. I think Ambassador Pritchard mentioned the $200 million to North Korea as an example. Thank you.
Who wants to tackle that?
So, I mean, China is going out into the world in some major ways. I think the most significant way is in order to enhance their energy security. So they've been very active in the energy markets, particularly in places in the world where the U.S. has been less of a presence and less of a force, sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, Central Asia. I think that a lot of activity by the Chinese generally on raw materials. They perceive their own lack of raw materials as one of their strategic weaknesses and are trying to act to minimize that. The other thing that's happening now in very, very big ways, of course, are Chinese firms are now becoming active players on the global stage. And that's something that you'll see in a very, very big way in the next few years. And then particularly in the region, they have strong strategic relationships that are backed up with lots of revenue, as well as military support. They are very, very important backers of Pakistan, especially in the region, and of course North Korea. But they have a huge presence now in South Korea, economically and commercially, all over Southeast Asia. So this is exactly the phenomenon that Chaz was talking about last night, and it's something that definitely has a lot of momentum behind it. But it's commercial and economic. They really don't have the ability to project power in a military sense.
I would just add on this that I think that there's so much distrust of the United States. I mean, they've been free riding on us for 30-some years more and protecting sea lanes for their energy supplies, for all the trade and container ships and everything else. We've done it for them. As Chas said, a global free public good to everybody protecting this. But I think they don't trust us. I mean, you would think that they would say, this is great, you can keep paying the bill and we'll just keep our defense budget down. But they want to build their ability to protect themselves in the long run. I think the challenge for us is how do you turn that into the 1,000-ship Navy? How do you turn that into something where we work together to protect sea lanes that we both need in the whole global, we need not only for any particular supplies, as pointed out by Chas, that the energy supplies that come out of the Gulf are insignificant for us. It's for the whole world economy. But if they got stopped, you know, the world economy tanks, the price of oil goes through the ceiling, and we suffer for it too. Well, we need to together
and the Chinese are participating in the anti-piracy
Yes, an anti-piracy operation. That's the pooling of power that they're engaged in the big pool of the Gulf of Aden. Right. And we need to build on that and try to get to the point where we trust each other enough that we can do burden sharing to protect sea lanes, protect global trade and transport. And the other piece, I think, is to getting more confidence in the market, so that Chinese are not worried about, getting control of energy production to protect their economic security. Because the fact of the matter is, if the global, It's a global market. It's globally shared oil. It's particularly an oil, such a fungible commodity. And I was told some time ago that much of the production out of Sudan was actually being sold to Egypt and Japan. I mean, why take it home? Why, you sell it on the spot market or whatever. But get confidence in these global markets on the one hand, that you don't have to worry about locking them up. And on the other hand, understand that we're all going to face these resource crunches. And we're going to have to find some way to work together on food and energy and lithium and rare earths and the rest of it, so that we can manage it for the global economy to keep growing and our own national security. We're stuck with each other. And we got to figure out how do we then act on it, build cooperation based on that. And the trust issue, I think, is the biggest impediment right now.
Fascinating. Chuck.
I'm Jory Squibb from Camden. This is a question about American foreign policy. I've always been really happy with our China policy over the years, which is kind of based on trade, baby, trade, you might say, and also on really not sweating the political whistleblowing human rights side too much. I consider that our policy there to be really have been a very practical and very honest policy, which I think has been a real gift to the Chinese people to offer this enormous market to them, and a mixed blessing to American people as well, in terms of certainly changing the way we wear clothes and own our goods are now mainly Chinese, largely Chinese, and certainly our landfill is full of a lot of discarded Chinese stuff, but it's been a practical thing. And on the other hand, we have our policy vis-a-vis rogue states like Cuba and North Korea and Iran, which are basically designed to isolate and to punish these states. And it's usually the people in these countries that suffer from this foreign policy. And I'm just wondering, when are we going to wake up that one policy seems to be very, very successful, and one seems to be a flaming failure. And so I'd just like to hear an apology for that.
Who
Jack,
wants
you
to
want to
attack
make an
this
apology?
one? Jack?
Former diplomats, you get to
Yeah, all right.
ambassador.
At the end, if you don't hear the word apology, then fill it in there. But no, it's an interesting point of view, but I don't think that the outcome is either as consequential or the same with each of our, however you want to label them, rogue countries, whether it was Libya, Iran, Cuba, as you mentioned, or North Korea. So let's take a look at what we've done with North Korea over the recent past. We've gone in various stages of rewarding what we call bad behavior, to reacting and saying we're not going to reward bad behavior, we're going to isolate them. The problem with a country like North Korea, as I started on that slide, we have to solve the problem. We just can't wait it out. North Korea has had a recent history in the last 20 years or so where people have been expecting its demise at every turn.
Like Mark Twain.
I can recall when I was on active duty at SINCPAC, a year prior to the death of Kim Il-sung, there was a rumor of his death. And the Navy commander at the time turned to his intelligence chief and he says, "All right, tell me, you're the intel guy, is he dead or alive?" And you could see this mental flip of a coin, and the Air Force one-star said, "He's dead." And of course he wasn't, but
Can't have uncertainty.
Right. We have to have some type of active policy. Now, one of the things that has been both a plus and a minus of the Obama administration is they changed the dynamic early on of how they dealt with the North Koreans. They simply said, just kind of act up in a little way and we don't care. We're not coming to your party. And people were stunned because in the Clinton administration and even in the Bush administration, particularly towards the end, we were guilty of chasing after the North Koreans at every little turn. And when the Obama administration came in and says, we just don't care, you know, and you go, well, that's kind of refreshing. It changed that dynamic. It put the North Koreans back on their heels. And even at one point, they put a title to it. They called it Strategic Patience. You know, and for 6 or 8 months or so, I thought, that's not bad. But I've come to the conclusion and say publicly, for which the administration does not like to hear, that strategic patience is an attitude. It is not a policy. It does not solve the problem. It does not get us to the point where we are not concerned with proliferation. So we've got to do some things with North Korea that even as they may feel repugnant, we've got to find ways, in my mind, to reward the positive, encourage whatever minor acts that are positive by the North Koreans, engage them on those aspects of it. We need to ensure that we're doing the things from a policy point of view that shapes the environment so they make the right choices, even if it's a negative environment. But there's something active about that, and that we ought not to simply not engage them and wait them out, because we'll not get to where we want to go.
Well, going back to your talk, and the fact that the worst is behind us for the last couple of years anyway, do you think we're going to be able to react the Obama administration possibly?
Let me follow up on that, because there's a concern that I have in this current environment where the North Koreans are reaching out. Now, in an artificial way, they want to get to us, but nonetheless, they are reaching out to the South Koreans. What the South Koreans are doing, and I've talked to them directly about this, they are changing the goalposts. They smell some degree of vulnerability with the North Koreans' position. And where they were last year, in the midst of this horrendous military provocations and the worst relationship they've had in a long time, they were publicly saying, we'd like to have an apology and an accountability from the North Koreans, but that won't hold up. If we can get back to six-party talks. If the North Koreans are sincere in the denuclearization process, we'll separate that. What we have seen most recently, 2 weeks ago, on the 8th of February, the North and the South met in a preliminary way at the working level of the military, at a colonel level. And the South Koreans' position was, before we will let you, and we will agree to move to the more senior level to discuss these issues, you must first apologize. It is now a precondition for any forward movement on there. That is the one element that can put a pall over my somewhat optimistic view of what 2011 will look like. The South Koreans need to get a little bit more realistic on this. They need to separate the issues, engage where they can appropriately, but we are close to not moving in that. So there's no apology there, there's an explanation.
No way.
Well, we can. There's no reason not to, with a couple of exceptions. Now, if we have a history between you and I in which you say, by the way, I've got a lot of magnesite to sell, I've got minerals and ore, and I'm say, oh, Cargill, and I say, okay, I'll give you grain in return. And I have a shipment of grain going to you, and you've got magnesite on the dock, and then somebody says to you, hey, I'll give you a nickel more for that magnesite, and you go, sure, and you ship your magnesite out, and then you say to Cargill, well, come on, unload your grain. Now, that's not a fictitious story. That's actually what happened. They have a very, very bad track record from a trade perspective.
Dave, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I hope that Jack's right about this year, but I really see the North Koreans as serial provocateurs, and I don't think the transition is at all resolved. And I think in that context, I mean, to my mind, it's one of the very big wild cards out there. I think, I mean, you know, we've tried to engage China on this worst contingency planning thing. Of course, the Chinese, I think, would like to do it at one level, but they can't do it because if it ever got out, then their relationship with the North would be destroyed. And they're really now focusing on enhancing their capacity to influence the North. So we're stuck here. And I mean, when I think about really bad contingencies between the US and China, I think that's the one that I really worry about is things go very much downhill.
Go south.
The US and the South Koreans go north to secure the nuclear facilities. The Chinese come in to secure security in the country, and that's the potential for really unpleasant things.
I just wanted to make a general comment, and you asked about Iran as well. And I'm no expert on Iran, and I encourage Ambassador Freeman tomorrow when we have the larger group to address this. But it strikes me one of our problems is we don't really want to engage to find out how the other side's thinking and how they see their security problems and dilemmas. I mean, I know nothing about Iran, but I know there's a war going on either side of it, and it's our troops doing the fighting. They have a very unhappy neighborhood from their perspective. There's a lot of things that have to do with their interests, their security, et cetera, that are not just Ahmadinejad being, this wacko, crazy guy and all the mullahs. I mean, we have a bit of a history with them going back to 79. But we've also passed up, I think that in 2003, was it, that they wanted a dialogue of civilizations and the Bush administration just ignored them before Ahmadinejad came along. I mean, we have to somehow figure out, and this is the bigger point I was trying to make earlier, and live in a world where you're going to have to acknowledge the interests of others, their points of view, and find out how you can figure out how to work together. And this is not to suggest any particular policy towards Iran, but I think that it's part of the calculus here. And even with the North Koreans, how do they think? How do they see their security? How do they interpret all these incidents? And it would be probably helpful dealing with them, and I'm sure Jack and many others have tried to get at least inside their heads. Doesn't mean you agree with them, but you're at least trying to figure out where they're coming from. And that's really one of the big problems of the US-China relationship. So it's a problem that we need to address, is how do we really understand and deal with the interests of the other party in these cases.
Good question, Jory. You got some great answers. Number one.
Jay Fetterman from Huntington, New York. I was surprised when President Hu was surprised when the Chinese Air Force trotted out their new so-called stealth aircraft. Now, how ominous is this as a sign of a disconnection between the President of China and the armed services?
It's a volunteer answer in the audience.
You want to answer? Oh.
But Chaz will have an answer to that one.
All right, well, okay, good. All right, I'll definitely.
Maybe ask Ambassador Freeman up here, right in the front row. Because you've recently talked to
You speak, Bannon, you run your mouth.
I think there's a misunderstanding behind this.
I'll give one really intelligent answer
Well
today.
Banning. I think there's a misunderstanding behind this. This is a prototype being tested at the Chengdu Aircraft Industries Corporation. An important prototype. The test was attended by senior Air Force officers from Beijing, but still a prototype test. In our system, prototype tests are not cleared through the policy shop at the Defense Department. They are handled on the acquisition side, and people on that side don't give a fig what foreign leader is in Washington. And I suspect that in this case, it may be those who did the test did have it in mind to show Bob Gates something. But the senior leadership didn't know about it. President Obama doesn't know when the Skunk Works trots out some new black system for testing, and so I don't think I think a great deal of the press coverage of this was frankly totally out of line.
I think that's right.
All right. Does anybody here have a comment? Okay. No, wait. I'm going to do it. No, please. Professor Zhang has a question. And then Pete, we'll get to you. Okay.
Thank you. Now, to Benny and David, I think I have difficulty to understand the logic about Taiwan arms sale. I know it's a standard, argument. But remember, first of all, the only legal foundation is the Taiwan Relations Act, which is your domestic law. Now, you say we can use domestic law to do anything we want to do. That's your rule, okay? But that's, now, how long Chinese going to stand that? Secondly, the logic, you're selling weapons to a place you diplomatically don't recognize in order to fight a country where you diplomatically actually recognize. So logically, there is a problem, I think. I just don't see why this can never be changed.
I think it could be changed if you got, in recent years, there has been a much better relationship between the government on the mainland and the government on Taiwan. Yet, nonetheless, the missile buildup across the straits from Taiwan has not been slowed. I think that we can get some kind of an agreement between Taiwan and the mainland to sort of kick the political ball down the field for a decade or more, because I think the political waters would bear that. There could be a piece of that involved both a removal of rocketry and some agreement on downscaling on the U.S. side. But the notion, frankly, that the United States is not going to live up to its security commitments to Taiwan when Taiwan has not done anything to break the status quo that exists between itself and the mainland, it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And we can talk about these agreements that go way back to the start of the relationship between the U.S. and China, but it was made clear in those early days that there was going to be a military defense relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan. Now, that's evolved. It's part of history. It's not, I don't think anything is cast in stone, but the pathway forward here lies in discussions between the government in Beijing and the powers in Taipei, and that's where it has to go.
Okay, does that logical answer to the illogical action?
We're supposed to deal with the issue, we don't know the future. We're dealing with uncertainty here. Now, you say Taiwan didn't do anything, but you don't know whether or not Taiwan is going to do something in the future. Another territory may come along, he's pushing for independence. So we need a framework. This is why I argued why the Hu Jintao and the Obama meetings not success from a Chinese point of view. Is we actually want a joint communique. We want a new framework. This is not a Chinese idea. The late Richard Holbrooke is the one who first proposed a fourth communique. Let's set some new rules of the game here. But Americans now realize we don't want to talk about the new rules. That's our rule. So
no. Look,
therefore,
I think a fourth communique at some point would be a good idea. The basis to negotiate it doesn't exist right now.
On that note, we'll stop that and move to the next question. We can discuss it again tomorrow with the full panel, and that'll be the only thing we talk about with the full panel. Yeah, Pete.
Get the panels to a circle.
My name is Peter McSpadden. I'm from Rockport. Mr. Pritchard, what happens if the transition doesn't work? It implodes on itself. And what are the options then?
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. First of all, let me say that I'm somewhat surprised at how well in this accelerated succession plan the North Koreans have put these pieces together. They put guarantors in the framework of Jung Sung-taek, the brother-in-law. They moved a first vice minister over to be a deputy premier. They have re-elevated the power of the party to counterbalance the military just in case. All that having been said, I still am not sure, and prior to the September would say, I don't think it's going to work. So the premise of your question is you're probably on the majority side of what the betting is, that it probably won't work. So what are the consequences? What's going to happen? My sense is there will be some type of consortium led by the military, but it will have some component for a while of the Kim family, whether it's the brother-in-law or somebody else, that will try to rule. But absent a strong central figure that they have only ever had for the entire existence of the country, I don't think they have the wherewithal to transition without that. So what I would say in shorthand is it will mark the beginning of reunification, that there will be some period of time of failing of the state. That may be a couple of years. I can't put a time parameter on it, but I think it will ultimately lead to some type of negotiated movement towards reunification, because the country will rapidly begin to spiral downward.
All right, they're rioting, I understand, in the Strand Theatre because they've got a question. Is that right, Jim? All right, let's have it. We've listened to the panel discuss the many challenging issues facing us as a country. What advice would you give the 20 to 30-year-old people in the audience who are looking to be positive change agents in these transitional times? Who wants to tackle that?
Well, I think there are just an enormous number of opportunities for young people to get engaged in these issues around the world. I always encourage young people to join the Peace Corps. I think the Peace Corps remains an excellent experience, and it really helps, I think, build a resume that people can act on. There are lots and lots of non-governmental organizations involved in development work, humanitarian work around a lot of the different issues we've been talking about, environmental issues, health issues, water issues. Let me put in a strong pitch for those who are inclined. I think diplomacy and intelligence are very interesting, very rewarding careers for young people, and I think that our foreign service and our intelligence services are really still looking to, they're still in hiring mode. They haven't cut off. So I think there's a lot to do, and I think, frankly, that also, joining the military, particularly as a career, becoming an officer in the military, having gone to Iraq and Afghanistan many times, and no matter what you think about these conflicts, the quality of the young men and women who are wearing the uniform of the U.S. military is absolutely extraordinary.
I would completely agree with everything Dave said. I would just add, in terms of education, I think we really need to do more interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary education. We tend to teach people in a very stovepipe way, especially graduate schools. And I've always been pleased that my PhD is in politics, not political science. That's an oxymoron, and I think there's a lot of very narrow thinking and, so we say, theology involved in a lot of these disciplines. And the problems are, not cut up by disciplines: sociology, anthropology, psychology, political science, economics, or hard sciences. It's a multidisciplinary world, you might say. And the chart I showed you of how all these things interconnect, well, we don't train people to think that way, and we're going to need to. So I would say broaden your education and your view both in space and time. Space meaning the range, the breadth of things, not just worrying about going into great depth on one thing. And the time frame, looking forward, also maybe looking in the back. A book I'll recommend that I put up on my last slide there about recommended reading, but it's a very interesting new book that just came out last fall called Why the West Rules for Now by Ian Morris of Stanford, who's he's an archaeologist and a historian. He has about a 25,000-year history of humanity looking forward to 2103. He happens to be rather pessimistic about the future, or at least sees the next 40 years as decisive of the future of humanity beyond that. I happen to agree with that basic notion that we are in a very decisive period. These 20 to 30-year-olds are going to play a really key role, and we need to educate our people to think in these much broader terms, much more multidisciplinary, and much more of a time frame on them about where the forces shaping the world and how we can marshal the forces we want, find the butterflies that we can, unleash to make the changes the way we want them to go. Shape the world, not just be victims of the world. And I think it's going to be in your hands, or put it a different way, we kind of screwed it all up. Good luck.
Jack.
Yeah. Well, let me add just a little bit of a specific point on that, and that is
About how we've screwed it up?
We've been hearing about that. Let's how we're going to correct it. Yeah.
how banning has screwed it up.
Oh, okay.
Mea culpa.
Yeah. But in terms of 20 and 30-year-olds, being more internationally involved is absolutely essential. And there's a couple ways to do that. If you're already working, or if you have the option of finding a company that has an overseas presence, go there. Understand the climate, the philosophy. Somebody asked, why don't you get inside the mind of the North Koreans? Well, get inside the mind of anybody from their perspective. I'm on a board of directors of a very small organization called International Students Conferences that right now involves two countries, Japan and Korea. We bring 40 Japanese and separately 40 Koreans to the United States with an equal number of American students. And then they split up and they join American, Korean, American, Japanese, and then they travel around together for 4 weeks on a program that they develop academically at 4 different universities, addressing different problems from their own perspectives. Now, on the case of the Japan side, it's been going on for 75 years. It involved Henry Kissinger. The Korean one I helped begin. It's in its 3rd or 4th year, but it builds lifelong experiences that are significantly different than a semester abroad, which I also recommend. But getting deeply involved on an international scale is where you ultimately, when you're given the authority, because you will not be given the authority as a 30-year-old, unless you run for elective office. But when you get there,
Might be too old, huh?
then you'll have that basis to actually make a change.
And the only thing I would add to 20-year-olds that are studying now is to learn fluently a foreign language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if it's only Spanish, but
Absolutely.
Mandarin, Arabic, something more difficult.
There are quite a few people around who speak.
Oh, I know that. But I mean, All right, I'm afraid we've kept you all late, but I think it's been worthwhile. It was really great.
Terrific. Nice job.